First of all, I want to say thank you for letting me be here today. I want to wish all of you safety in this time, and also I hope that you're all in an okay place when it comes to bills being due today. There's been a lot of actions with my work with the Colorado Latino Forum around housing and rent and mortgage freeze and cancellation. So I just want to put those well wishes out there. You'll see here on this first slide my name, my website, my socials. Feel free to follow me. It's where I share a lot of my content. And I want to start by just really acknowledging the indigenous lands that we were on, with the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, and the Ute who lived here. I myself am Jicarilla Apache. My people come from the headwaters of the Rio Grande along the Conejos River. And you'll see here in my picture an acknowledgement of the missing and murdered indigenous women. This is a crisis in indigenous communities directly associated with climate concerns and oil and gas, natural gas extraction. There are many, many women on a regular basis that go missing. You'll see this red handprint here as a sign that we all do, and we wear it on our face in public hearings and in places to bring awareness to this problem. And so I just want to start with that. And then I want to touch on some of the groups that I'm going to talk about today and some things that I've been involved in. So I am the Colorado Climate and Water Organizer for Green Latinos. I'm going to talk about Green Latinos in the next slide. The Colorado Latino Forum is a C4 nonprofit that gets involved in a whole host of issues ranging from police and justice reform to education, wages, you name it. I am the elected co-chair of the Colorado Latino Forum, and we have about 14 members currently. It's existed for more than 10 years, originally forming around the time when Ken Salazar became the Secretary of Interior. We had hoped that he would have been replaced with a Latino. He was not. It also was at the same time as the census and the redrawing and redistricting, and so they came together. There have been many prominent Latino leaders in Colorado who have been a part of the Latino Forum. And right now, currently, 11 of our members have run for office or held office, including myself. The next is Sunrise Movement, which I'm sure people have been hearing a lot about, a national youth movement to push predominantly the Democratic Party from the center to the left on environmental issues to deal in particular with the Green New Deal. The next is the Sierra Club. They claim, and a couple other organizations claim, that they're the oldest conservation organization in the country. I am a member of the Sierra Club. I joined them after I went a few years ago on a very long trip to more than 22 national parks and monuments. I traveled for 8 months. It was a really great respite for me after I lost my city council race. And what I did come to see was that when I went to Glacier National Park and they told me there used to be hundreds of glaciers, and now there's less than 20. I went to the Oregon Caves National Monument, deep, deep underground, hundreds of feet underground. They had been tracking the temperature inside that cave for more than 100 years. And in the last 10 years, it's had a 4-degree increase. So that was some really scary news for me. And so when I came home, I really tried to center and find organizations that I could work with on that. I do want to acknowledge that the Sierra Club has had a legacy of exclusion and racism in the past, but we believe, myself included, that we've moved beyond that, and they've done a lot with the environmental justice community to aid with the Colorado Latino Forum here in the regional area, in particular in Global Elyria Swansea and Commerce City. The next one here is Resilient Denver. Resilient Denver is a citizens-led group that is working to push the city and county of Denver on their climate goals. We have a petition that has successfully made the ballot that I'll be talking about later that you can vote on if you live in Denver in November. And we're working through a process for a fracking ban and storage of toxics to be banned from toxic wastewater from fracking in Denver County. We had hoped to launch our petitioning for 420 and Earth Day, but obviously COVID got in the way. The next one is Denver Inter-Neighborhood Cooperation, which is 50 years ago in Denver. There used to not be a public process to involve people in what was happening with city decisions. And so they gathered together and they got an ordinance passed that created what they call registered neighborhood organizations. They have them in over 120 neighborhoods in Denver, and they hope to serve as a conduit for both information to the community and for the community to interact with the city agencies. Inter-neighborhood cooperation is an association of nearly 100 of them. I went to my first INC meeting probably when I was 25 years old, most interested in parks issues originally. I serve as the co-chair of zoning and planning, working on zoning and planning issues, and climate change planning fits into that. And so I am in the executive leadership of that, and I will be touching on it. And then the last one here is Yes on 300, also known as the Denver Green Roof Initiative, which was a landmark citizen-led initiative, all volunteer-based, that broke and shattered records, and I think really showed people that citizens could push forward policy even against big dollars, but also that we were ready to lead on climate change here in Denver. We won by many, many points despite being outspent by a lot, and so I'll touch on that later. But I really just wanted to put these logos in front of you so you understood how they fit into the context later. So Green Latinos is a national nonprofit organization that convenes a broad group of people, both locally, regionally, and nationally, around natural resource and conservation issues for our public health. We have subcommittees and we have members all across the country. I am the first organizer that they actually ever hired. They had predominantly stayed in Washington, D.C. and used their network to bring people to Washington, D.C. to leverage citizen advocacy to pass the kind of legislation that we want. We realized that Colorado was a really great place to set up a hub to both work here, but in the Four Corners area. We're now in talks of a strategic plan on what other states are going to come online next. We started to hire some part-time consultants in some other cities. We've found that there is a very large void that is missing in this process for Latinos. And we understand that sometimes people say that environmentalism is not an identity that brings us all together in 100%. We know that our communities are often the frontline communities. We are the environmentalist communities, and try as they might, other organizations, they're not led by Latinos. And there are some other organizations that are indigenous people participate. Some people like myself in Colorado know our history, but there are Chicanos often associate themselves with the Mexica Empire in Mexico, and so that's something that they've really latched onto. What you'll hear, at least in our community, is Latinx, Hispanic, Chicano, Baricua, Mexicano, Tejano. These are all different words that are myself. We really feel like over personal necessity for people who have different identities, and so that's a battle that we continue to fight even within ourselves. And we also struggle with what we describe as colorism, which is you are I think if you're black or if you're brown, sometimes you're not brown enough, sometimes you're too brown. These are things that we are actively trying to get behind. We see, because I think it's really important for us to understand that we have accountability to heal within ourselves. We also know that if we lift ourselves, if we lift our voices, those people who are not Latinos that live are Latinos. And so, we're not exclusive. People can join Green Latinos and support our cause. We do have some voting rights for members, and all that is unified. But if you identify with the causes that I'm going to be talking about today, you can join us in a supporter way to help us share information and raise our voices. So I want to start this conversation with climate justice, and really is within climate justice. It's environmental justice, and it's a just transition. So So a just transition is a framework that really came out of the union movement. I do nationally, we're involved with what is Green Alliance. Here in the state of Colorado, we have a Blue Green Alliance. I don't personally sit on that table, but it's something that I'm trying to get to. We're in these conversations about how we know that we have to make a jump to renewable energies as quickly as possible. But what does that mean for the people who are working in these industries now? We don't want to abandon them and have them suffer either mentally with mental health or economically. But there is still a caveat conversation here. There might not always be able to promise equal jobs for equal pay. You know, if you make $100,000 working in a refinery, you know, the green industry may only support a $70,000 or an $80,000 job. But that difference in the margin that they're making is being reaped on the back of people in the community at every stage of the way. So just transition in this conversation about how we work with workers is something I think the environmental movement has struggled with in the past, trying to paint broad strokes without consulting the workers. In particularly, we have some troubles with pipe fitters. And I think it's understandable because the pipe fitters have really good jobs and they're the ones laying the pipes for the natural gas. And so trying to figure out how do we retrain them and offer them fairness through this process is something that Green Latinos believes in, but any of these broad-based coalitions I'm working with are there. So this next one is about environmental justice communities. And this I actually pulled from California. And California has probably one of the most robust definitions. But we're working through similar legislation here in Colorado, which I will touch on later, that does qualify environmental justice communities. And when we read this, we read that workers are missing. And so we feel like if we can bring workers into environmental justice communities, we can help bridge this just transition gap. For air toxics in particular, or water toxics, the workers who are working the closest to it are really the ones that are facing the impacts first. And so that's why we really want to raise the workers. There is something that I really want to point out in here, and I think that it's people who have experienced disparate implementation of environmental regulations, requirement, practices, and activities. So even though they have processes which are open and public to be having conversations for any sort of rule or regulation or permitting process, often environmental justice communities show up there and they ask for these permits not to happen, and they happen anyways. Perfect example was Suncor Energy just a few years ago. They had a permit update. More than we asked for a field hearing in the community. It was unfortunate that only one of the air quality control commissioners actually decided to come and be present. That's all they're required. We felt like that sent a message to us from these other commissioners that if they weren't willing to hear CDPHE actually under John Hickenlooper's administration actually approved these permits. And so that's something that I really want to note, that you will start to see some themes here, that in between Hickenlooper's administration and Polis's administration, though Polis's administration isn't perfect and we still fight with them, there are leaps and bounds ahead when it comes to environmental justice communities and fighting for us. I'm going to touch on some things later here where you will see who Hickenlooper, who is now running for U.S. Senate. I've actually gotten into some digital journalism battles with Hickenlooper's administration as of late. Green Latinos and the Colorado Latino Forum and some other organization hosted climate justice forums and climate justice debates where we were allowing them to actually debate each other. The Democratic Party wasn't allowing that, but we wanted to allow, we believe this problem is so large. Hickenlooper has chosen to skip both of them, as well as Cory Gardner, and he has refused to answer our questions around climate justice. And so that's one thing that I just want to see is going to be a theme here. So I touched a little bit earlier on the Jimenez principles, and these are principles for democratic organizing that came out of 1996, and I have them listed here 1 through 6. That last one, number 6, this commitment to self-transformation, comes back to this colorism conversation that I was having with you about Green Latinos. We have to understand that we need to be inclusive, that we need to look to people who are living the lived experience and place them first. Later, I'll be touching on some state bills that we are running, and an example of letting people speak for themselves and emphasizing the bottom up is when we know that the people are going to be at hearings all day, we go out of our way, if you're a paid organizer, to ensure that anybody who is there from the community who is giving up their time, and if you've ever testified at the Capitol, you'll know that even if it starts at 1:30, you might not testify until 6 o'clock. So what can we do to make the experience easier for them? Help them with parking, help them by giving them food during the process, and making sure that their voices are the ones who go first. um, there is an important part about building these relationships between us. And there's an expression that I really like, and it's moving at the speed of trust. There's often a lot of distrust between government, in particular environmental, um, in my community and a lot of frontline communities. And it really puts people like yourselves who hope to get these bureaucratic jobs sometimes in a pickle. And so I just want you to know that we don't intend to give it to you so hard, on purpose. We're lashing out with the sentiment from the doors we knock and the things that we do. And we don't intend to take such a harsh tone at times. And I just want to acknowledge that, having worked in the government myself, I've worked in 3 branches of local government: the mayor's office, city council, and the public defender's office. That sometimes we just have to take a breath and say, we know it's not us, and to not internalize that. And so I really just wanted to acknowledge that from the beginning. So I was originally asked, by your professor, to have a conversation around climate policy on the international, federal, Colorado, and local level, and how my work, through these different organizations, has interweaved over the years. And so by no means is this everything that's going on, but I really tried to do my best, to try to wrap my head around this conversation. And I also think it important to note that when we're talking about climate, it almost always intersects with every single issue. Public lands being one of the largest producers of the climate problems in America, the impacts on water, transportation, every single sector of our society has some sort of impact. And we're working to try to do our best to make moves and regulation to try to deal with that. Along the way, I am going to have a tone probably about how businesses have participated either to help us or to block us. But it's important to know that sometimes it's easier to move corporate accountability faster than it is to move some sort of regulatory process with the government. And so where and how we choose to leverage those things is really important. I think another thing that's important to note here is that your elected leaders do matter, and those that they appoint also matter. There are members that sit on commissions and water commissions, gas commissions, all the way down to public health at the local level. We are trying to get our heads wrapped around, when are the sensitive periods in time for us to target replacing these people with advocates from our community, whether it be through the election cycle or through commissioners. I also want to acknowledge that we have run into many impasses along the way through legislation or executive authority, and that is where, they call them citizens initiatives. I would really like to call them resident initiatives. Residents, you do have to be a citizen to sign it, and a registered person to be able to sign it. But there are many people in our community under the age of 18, undocumented, here on visas, who live in these communities and want better environmental conditions for themselves, and so they participate. I would caution in the future, anytime you see the opportunity where people are using citizen, question yourself on whether resident can fit into that space better. And if so, I suggest you make that move or suggestions to your superiors. So I think the international conversation, at least in my opinion, goes all the way back with the United Nations and the Kyoto Protocol, which really took a look at these 6 main greenhouse gases. And you can see, it was adopted in 1997, but I do want to point out recent information has come to light that many of the large oil and gas producers had an idea about this science going back more than 30 years. Green Latinos and many of the other organizations I'm involved with really do see this as a criminal act. And so if we can get a change in administrations, it is something that we are going to pursue. But the Kyoto Protocol, which was entered into and took a rather long time to ratify, as you can see, almost until 2005. It wasn't until 2005 that that was ratified, but 192 countries participated. This also includes tribal nations, and I want to make sure that even though the federal government treats indigenous nations as domestic dependent nations because of backwards colonization Supreme Court decisions all the way back to the 1800s, those treaties recognize the fact that they are their own individual nations and have the ability to participate in these and to participate in a party status with the United Nations. So I do want to touch on the United Nations development goals. Often people refer to them as Agenda 21. Agenda 21 is something that I guess right-wing conspiracists often say is a plan to depopulate the earth, but in reality, Agenda 21 was a declaration of environmental rights and principles that talked about healthcare and housing as rights, and talked about how we were going to make decisions to improve our water and repair our fisheries. And so if that's something that you're interested in, I really suggest taking a look at Agenda 21. One that happened more recently that people like to talk about at the COP21 was the Paris Climate Accords, which came together with a lot of presidents, including ours in the United States, to say that globally we were going to tackle this problem. It took out a look at the largest polluters, the United States, China, Brazil, India, Russia, the people who are really participating in making these emissions happen. There's a lot in here that has to do with information and technology sharing to help us get to these goals. I've always been of the thought process that we have this sister city program, that the sister city program should be re-identified to align people who live in the same climates so that their schools and their governments can work on solutions to similar environmental issues. I do want to point out that even though Obama had signed on to this, it was not ratified through our Congress, I do not believe. But moreover, under Obama and his above all energy, also this includes Biden, we became the #1 oil and gas producer in the world, which has grave impacts on here in Colorado on our air quality and also to my communities in particular. And so as Biden is going through this election cycle, you know, he broke the fossil fuel pledge. He's lied to sunrise advocates to our faces, and he's unwilling to acknowledge how this has been accelerated even under their leadership. And so really thinking through who we elect and whether even the federal government is in a position to move fast enough to deal with some of these problems. This here is a model with the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, that talks about where we're at and on target for these increased emissions. Now, when you're reading this, RCP is the representative concentration pathway, and this is them taking a look at these 6 greenhouse gases in combination and what glideway or pathway are we on. Now, this map here, it does say 4 degrees, and this one is from 2013. I didn't have enough time to find a new one. We're now reaching places where they're talking about 6 degrees centigrade. And one thing that I will say that has been successful for me in my organizing is we are not, as Americans, geared and ready to have conversations about Celsius. We're geared and ready to have conversations about Fahrenheit. And so when you do the math, there are going to be some places on this planet, if things go to the worst without changing them, where there'll be roughly 12 degrees increase. Well, people say, well, what does that mean? Well, if we had a 100-degree heat wave here at 105, well, that becomes 117. What happens if that carries on for 14 days, 17 days? It destroys crops. Only those who have access to wealth in the energy model that we have here will have the ability to cool their homes. And so we're going to see massive amounts of death around this globe just from temperature. And this doesn't talk about all the other cycles that Bill McKibben and the 350. I would also recommend a book called Changemakers, which talks about these currents that are running deep inside the ocean that affect a lot of our weather patterns here. I mean, I think if you live in Colorado, you're familiar with El Nino and La Nina and how they impact our monsoons. And I know most people think monsoon, they think Southeast Asia, but the changing patterns are actually what drives a lot of our rain here in August and in July. And so that's just something I wanted to bring to your attention. I think probably people have heard that Trump had made the decision to pull out of the Paris Agreement. He did not believe that it was fair, that China was not going to do their part. And so, why should we stunt our economic growth? I think right now, as public health professionals, you can see that there is a battle with climate and also with COVID about science, and whether our leaders are willing to really take a look at the science, and also whether they're willing to use the science to make the hard decisions, to make the trade-offs when it comes to the budget and the economy. We personally believe people before profits. Um, I was saying recently, or just right before this, there are many US mayors who seek to bypass Donald Trump and directly participate in the US climate talks, that we believe that we can still hold ourselves to these standards. I will say, and we will touch on this later, that even let's say our leadership mayor here in Denver, Colorado, Mayor Hancock, now he might come forward and he might say that he wants to stick to the Paris climate. But I will note later in this presentation that when I worked in his office, in a Denver Seeds office, doing environmental policy in 2012, we set ourselves on a path for 2020 goals. We will not meet a single goal of our 2020 goals. So mayors seeking to participate in climate talks does not transition to budgets. And I think there's a really important conversation that we're having with our community about how do we participate in the various funding cycles that exist. And right about now, if you were trying to get funding into the budget, let's say in the city and county of Denver, the budget office goes dark right about this time. So from January until April, you have an opportunity to get ideas in, but then you won't know until August when they put forward their first proposed budgets, and then trying to pull it apart to make changes. There are also larger funding cycles, particularly in transportation is a really easy one to understand. They have capital projects that only have funding every 4 or 5 years. There are grants that come from the federal government that only come every few years. And then beyond that, there are bonding opportunities that are brought to the public that we only have so many cracks at the apple. There is a growing movement here, not only at the state capitol, but in Denver to fight for public banking. And we believe that the 30% off the top in interest that is going to Wall Street is not benefiting our community. And we know that we desperately need to spend at least $100 million a year in Denver if we hope to meet the IPCC goals. And I'm going to talk a little later about how I've been working with Resilient Denver to actually get to those goals. So there was recently what they call a Conference of Parties 25. These Conference of Parties events, they happen in between these larger gatherings like the Paris Accords. So at the most recent one here in COP25, I actually sent over to your professor a recording that I had with a colleague of mine, a member of Green Latinos who works for a group called Texas Environmental Justice Advocacy Services. The fights that we have here with our one refinery, Suncor, they have with, as they describe it, more than 20 contiguous miles of industrial pollution without zoning in Texas. People actually live on these front fence lines in a really large. The only solutions cannot always be market solutions, that there are ancestral solutions like regenerative agriculture and forestry that can do wonders for much less of a price. The other concern I think about carbon capture or not carbon capture, carbon cap and trade is you get put in a position where yes, people are making trades, but all that really does is allow one industrial facility to continue to pollute, if not possibly increase their pollution because of the credits that they are trading. And what does that do? It has a disproportionate impact again on the frontline communities. Now there is a growing conversation about carbon capture, but when you look at these multi-billion-dollar carbon capture facilities, they often look just like refineries. They produce and use often similar chemicals that pollute the water nearby. Another solution that people continue to raise is nuclear. Well, that nuclear waste has to be stored in a community. Guess what? They're often stored in Latino communities, indigenous communities. Well, these raw materials have to be mined in someone's community, often in our communities. So we see non-market solutions as definitely a pathway forward. And I do just want to take a step back and say that Green Latinos was first formed by our now founder and CEO and executive director, Mark Magana, because he had spent time working in the White House and both in the Congress, liaising between the two. And when the first cap and carbon trade bill came forward, they sought to seek Latino input, but we did not have a strong network to respond. And so that was really the basis of why my organization even exists in the first place. So there's a large conversation about whether our governments are even going to pass the first test. I think what we're going to see when they start to analyze at this next meeting later this year is that many of the countries that have the most to lose, the small island countries, those in the southern hemisphere, they're going to meet their goals. They're going to have known that they have done their part. And it is on us in the first world, and really in America, leading the economy of the globe, to have this conversation about whether we're going to meet our goals or whether we're willing to let the world burn for short-term goals. I think Australia is a perfect example where nearly 4 trillion animals were killed by best estimations, and it impacted human beings in a way that we had not seen. I'm not sure if anyone else saw the maps where they overlaid Australia on top of the United States, but it would be as though both coasts were burning contiguously at the same time. So the next UN conference is here. It's going to be in the UK. If this is something that interests you, I'm sure with your career path and being a student, there are lots of opportunities for you to get yourself there. And so it's only April now. You would have some time to plan or to fundraise or do what you need to do, but I really just wanted to put that out in front of you. I myself have not had a chance to go to a UN conference. I'm setting myself a goal of trying to get here. So now I'm going to touch on federal work. Federal work, like I was saying, falls into the wheelhouse of the work I do with Green Latinos, Bureau of Land Management, the EPA, oceans, you name it. The Department of Interior is really in our wheelhouse, and the Environmental Protection Agency is in our wheelhouse, although there are crossovers between the work we do in the CDC and some of these other agencies. At the Capitol in the United States, we do have staff that regularly meets, and I work to organize members from Colorado and the Southwest region to go on fly-ins to learn how to advocate for themselves, and also to encourage them to regularly check in with their representatives and senators. I know that often people think that they're not accessible. I recently went and put on an environmental justice roundtable in Grand Junction, and that same day I walked into Corey Gardner's office. I called and I got a meeting. And so these people, even if they seem like they're not playing on our side for climate goals, definitely are willing to have the hard conversations. Sometimes they're rather brief, but we as Green Latinos, we do work in a bipartisan way, and like that is something that's important to us. We have found that water is often a bridge, public lands are often a bridge to get to the kind of policy we need. What I will say is that nationally speaking, the polls are in our favor of more than 80% of people thinking that climate change at least exists. Holy shit, we need to do something. So what I want to leave you with is that there is hope to pass this legislation. I will say that just coming from electoral politics, I do think that not only campaign finance reform in particular, but also possibly term limits might be put us in a position to actually place in leaders who are willing to make the changes we want. So I want to touch on these two groups that exist. There is the Bicameral Task Force on Climate Change, which has been around for almost 10 years, I believe, and it is chaired by Senator Sheldon Whitehouse from Rhode Island. I had an opportunity to sit and have a meal with him just this last fall, and they asked him a whole host of questions about what the heck is it going to take for us to get there. the number one thing that he said to me, and this will go back to what I was saying about corporate accountability, is he believes that the US Chamber of Commerce and their members and the Manufacturers Association of America, I might be getting that last one wrong, but it is it is the largest manufacturing association. These two organizations are the ones that inhibit the policy the most, and particularly with moderate Republicans who might be willing to take on legislation in our behalf. And he really encouraged me to encourage activists to really take aim at some of these businesses if they have headquarters in our community. And under his advice, I'm going to touch on later some actions that we've taken on Excel Energy to try to move the dial. Now, this next one here is the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. U.S. Representative Jonah Goose sits on this climate crisis committee. They had been working for the last year to gather input and ideas from the community. It was set to have been released this month, but due to the pandemic, it is now waiting release. But it is something that I have heard is like 400 pages long with lots of different chapters. I think it really takes some, I had sent to your professor some reading that from the federal climate report. It'll be very similar to that, but this will actually have strategies for us to get to the place that we need to be in. So keep a lookout for the House Select Committee's report. And if you follow me, that'll be something that my work will be engaging people on to try to drive revenue to the solutions that are suggested by the climate crisis. So the next one in this slide is just one of many, 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 many rules and regulations that the EPA under Donald Trump's administration has attempted to what we would call roll back, or some people call gut, but to go back into these laws and rules and regulations over industry that directly affects climate and fossil fuels, and the industry as a whole. We made huge gains under Democratic leadership with Obama for at least health and safety standards. And again, I want to remind you that under his administration, we grew as one of the largest, to become the largest oil and gas exporter in the world. But at least we got to a place where there was some better regulation around air quality, air toxics, and moving the energy industry into a better place. Now, I can say that there have been more than 100 of these rollbacks, and some of them are really hard for communities to participate, in particular indigenous nations, for them to participate in. I have had to fly, for example, to Salt Lake City for water rollbacks with less than 10 days notice and only in 2 cities. And I'm going to touch here in a minute on the National Environmental Policy Act, a 50-year law that dates back to the first Earth Day, the creation of the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, and the EPA. And this law, having worked so successfully, there were only 2 hearings here in DC. And we had only a month to get everybody from the other contiguous states there to even participate in this conversation. And so I will touch on that a little bit more. This one right here, clean cars, I'm also going to touch on a little bit, but you can see this is a lot to do with how we're using our public lands, including our the shelves in the ocean. And it's really important to note that even especially Republicans will come forward and say, look, I'm an environmentalist. I back the Land, Water, and Conservation Fund. And yes, those dollars do go back into our public parks and into our open spaces, but that money is derived from oil and gas exploration in the ocean. We saw what happened with the BP disaster, that these people were not being regulated, that they were not, they weren't living up to the standards that we need, and the costs were dramatic for the fishing industry, for the tourism industry, and for the countless amount of animals that were there. And so I just want to put it on your radar. There's a larger conversation about isn't it kind of counterproductive to destroy some form of public lands in order to fund the public lands that are closer to your backyard? And it's something I think in Colorado that when we have these conversations about fisheries and water toxics in the ocean and the plastics that are building up, that we are connected by these rivers and that these are our problems. And so we're working nationally within Green Latinos to have a conversation about how I can rally my members here in Colorado to support safety or public health and welfare issues along the coast of the United States. Um, so this one here is a chemical disaster rule. This is one that Earth Justice, by the way, Earth Justice is probably one of the neatest organizations in the world. When you get in trouble and you need an attorney, Earth Justice is that attorney for the community. And they actually came, and I met them originally in my fight against the refinery and in my fight with the highway expansion, where they served as our legal representation. And they actually brought me to Washington, D.C. to have a conversation and to testify about these rollbacks and the chemical disaster rules. And it was there at that visit to Washington, D.C. that I first met the Green Latinos. And I felt relief. I had never been in an environmental programming or event in which there were as many Latinos that outnumbered everyone else. And we have events that are all of us, and I felt alone. And now I feel like I have support, and lo and behold, I work for them. And it's really amazing. They recruited me to become this first organizer. This chemical disaster rule impacts refineries and other large facilities. And what it does is it has common sense reform in it, like if there is an incident, hiring a third-party analyst to try to figure out what the root cause is and try to make sure that this doesn't happen again. Also, emergency planning and fence line monitoring. These are all parts of it that EPA has attacked in recent years. Fortunately, Earth Justice has filed a legal brief against this and is in the courts. Between 80 and 90%, it depends on which organization you talk to about the statistic, but between 80 and 90%, high 80% are of the challenges that have been made to the rollbacks by Donald Trump have been won by the conservation and environmental community. It's just a shame that we have to continue using resources in this way. And one thought that's crossed my mind a lot is, as a defense tactic, to keep us scrambling, organizing each other to respond to these laws, we're not able to be as proactive to pass legislation. And so I see it as a tactic. It's a really disappointing tactic, but nonetheless it exists. This is another example of a court case in which we won, where this has to do with smog levels and the EPA and the 2015 ozone standards, something that I'm going to be talking about a little bit later with non-compliance with our air quality here. But I just want to use this as an example. This nebulizer here on this child, we stand for the mothers that wake in the middle of the night to their children gasping for air. And we stand with the workers who have chronic disease and they're not sure why. And we stand with, CDPG and environmental bureaucrats who want the data and to do the right thing. And so that's a lot of the work that we do is around this image right here, that this child deserves clean air just as much as the rest of us. So the Clean Car Standards Clean Car Standards is what it compels auto manufacturers to increase their standards to reduce the amount of toxic pollution that actually comes out of the tailpipe. California being the leader in this field, it helps bring more electric vehicles to the market. There's a lot of great things. We in Colorado just last year, under Polis's administration, was able to win through the Air Quality Commission this standard for zero emission vehicles and getting more into our community. Donald Trump and many of his supporters, and surprise, Subaru, who got caught illegally manipulating the data about their emissions and had to pay massive settlements, which we're trying to get pushed from the Colorado settlement. We're trying to push that money into school districts and into RTD and into electrifying buses, that commercial buses that are going through communities that already have high pollution densities in the first place. This right here is from our Attorney General, Phil Weiser. And there is a longer statement here, but he is saying that he's going to challenge this in court with the 14 states plus DC. But we do believe that this is the most effective way to target auto emissions for climate goals. It's this requiring more vehicles on the road. And on the other side, perhaps people remember Cash for Clunkers years ago, where we poorly passing emissions vehicles, and we gave tax credits to get people to turn them in. I think we're looking in this new stimulus package. By the way, there's likely to be a fourth stimulus package with environmental tax credits, hopefully programs like Cash for Clunkers. We do want the Cash for Clunkers for lightweight vehicles and commercial vehicles. Um, Often in these areas which are transitioning from industrial land to regular land, to residential, is where we have these problems. And so if we can help a small company in Globeville, Swansea turn in their 1990s truck and get a new truck, that's a win for them and that business, but it's also a win for the air quality of the people who live in that community. So I just went on the radio this morning at 9 o'clock talking about Green Latinos is sincerely pissed off about it, because not only in the last weeks has the EPA announced there would not be regulating environmental pollution during this pandemic to protect their workers, they say. The monitoring and some of that people can do from home. It's really a lot of smoke in the air. But then rolling back these clean cars, and particularly, again, I'll go back to Colorado. If you look in particular in Denver, but also in Grand Junction, along the highway, the people who live in those residential housing are low income people. And we know that here in Colorado, low income people are particularly Black, Indigenous, and Latinos. And so for him to release this, for the EPA to release this on Cesar Chavez Day, was a real slap in our face. Cesar Chavez being him and Dolores Huerta being the uniting force with the United Farm Workers to fight for pesticide reform. They used organizing tactics in a way that sincerely worked. And so it is a day that we honor our ancestors and our elders. And so for him and for this administration to do this on this day, it did not miss us. I'm currently working on an op-ed that we're trying to get placed into the Washington Post or the New York Times. I was quoted in the New York Times around water policy and the Waters of the USA rule just late last year. But water, though, interfaces here, and you'll see that public lands interface here. I really just wanted to focus on climate and energy policy. Here, this is the National Environmental Policy Act that I was saying was being rolled back. This is an op-ed that I had placed in the Denver Post, calling out the Trump administration for only having 2 meetings. We ended up having a large gathering here in Colorado, and it was a marathon of a sprint, let me tell you, because we hosted the country. The country came here. Indigenous nations came here. What was really frustrating about this process was originally they had limited and capped the participation. And so if you can imagine, if you wanted to go see your favorite concert, that's what they did to us. And they only allowed so many tickets to be out there. Well, we all organized, and we were downtown, and we were having rallies, and we were speaking. We really centered Indigenous people, which was really amazing, I think. And what really came out of it was the very first session in the morning, they ended up canceling early or closing down early because they didn't have enough people to show up that had the tickets that they had. So there was actually a march on the EPA building. It was only a block away, and it was organic completely, and they occupied the space in the EPA, in the base, in the first floor, and they demanded more tickets, and we got them, and we were able to get more people to participate. We're still waiting to hear what's going to happen with this rollback, but I think the most important thing to take away from NEPA is this is really what guides the environmental process. I'm sure you all know, with highways and with these energy projects. We just saw recently a win with the Access Dakota pipeline for that community, pushing it back to a NEPA process. And we know that if Donald Trump and his administration say that these environmental regulations hold up projects, and I would say they hold up bad projects. And if you end up in litigation for 5 years, there's probably a reason that you ended up in litigation for 5 years, and they can take a look at it. But I would say more than 90% of the time, NEPA works in the regular process, and it ensures the safety and water quality and air quality for the community. So that is where I'll leave it. There is some bright news, I guess. That's why I picked this one, Bright New Day. There is a 100% Clean Economy Act that has been introduced in the US House. There is nearly a companion bill in the Senate side that helps transition us with legitimate targets by 2030 and 2050. One of our largest concerns on moving towards renewable energy, particularly me as a person whose retirement date is 2054, smack dab in the middle of when shit's supposed to hit the fan, is that we will continue to say we have these goals, but then not meet them and then expect all of the change to happen at the end. And so we're trying to benchmark to make sure that along the way, there are real goals. And if we're not making the goals, that we have a chance to realign the policy. Um, I do want to take a minute just to talk about plastics. And plastics is often seen as a water quality problem, which it is. But these plastics are produced, and every step along the way, they are causing environmental harm. From the extraction phase to the transportation phase with leaking pipes into the community, to the processing with the refineries and the air toxics, and now into these facilities to produce plastics, and particularly in Houston, one of the largest petrochemical complexes in the world. I do want to note that Diana DeGette here has been working with me on a hydrogen cyanide bill to rein in emissions from refineries all across the country to set a health safety limit for hydrogen cyanide. I have been working diligently with her office and Green Latinos to have a field hearing in Houston. We think it would be really powerful. And it goes back to those Jimenez principles that I was talking to you about before, about going to the people who are on the front lines and allowing their voices to be heard. There is an international group called Beyond Plastics that organizes on this. And what we're seeing is the large oil and gas industries, as they're trying to figure out their long-term economic viability, are doubling down on plastics. Okay, well, if you don't want gasoline for cars and everything else is going 100% clean, then they can go to the plastics market. And so this isn't it right here. This federal lawmakers finally have a real plan. This comes to actually a Pollution and Prevention Act that was introduced. The closest senator to us with it is Udall from New Mexico, but it sets goals saying you cannot expand these facilities. We're not going to build any new plastics facilities. And then it goes through both incentives and both through regulation on what we can do to get plastics out of our society. This is moving at the federal level, which is great, and I'm going to touch on it later. But I do just want you to take away this idea that the plastics are directly related to the air quality problems that we're having here, and it's something that we really need to be involved with. So this last one here is the EPA and what they call regional haze plans. These haze plans, what they do is they regulate the opacity of the air in national parks, with the goal being, if you're going to go to a national park, it should be as pristine and beautiful as it possibly can be. It is something that we are later this year going to be involved in a regional haze plan for Rocky Mountain National Park. And it's believed that this is another tool that we can use to clamp down on the air quality problems here in the Front Range, because that air floats over and we are having declining air quality problems. I recently went and visited in Kentucky the Mammoth Caves. Mammoth Cave is the largest cave system in the world. They are known to have the worst haze problem of all of the national parks, and you can really see it. Now, a lot of it has to do with the fact that they continue to mine and use coal as their direct energy source. And so trying to get away from that is something that's really important to me and to us. There's a showdown with Trump over many of these. And it really has to do with the fact that we're in serious non-attainment for our ozone. And that gets me into Colorado policy. And so I want to start by touching on the Public Utilities Commission and how we're being involved in it. And so there was a rate case that had to do with electric vehicles and whether we could get a lower price set aside in particular for commercial uses. So we're talking school buses, RTD buses, those kinds of things. We attempted to participate in this as the Colorado Latino Forum with the neighbors who live in North Denver and Elyria, Swansea. You'll see here Globeville. Unfortunately, the PUC denied us party status. And that's really disappointing. I think this was the first time what a group known as the Environmental Justice Coalition attempted to participate in the PUC. And so we're really just trying to think through what we can do to interface with the PUC, because Excel next year is going through an energy resource plan. They're got some carve outs in 1261 that allow them to continue to build and use coal well into the 2030s. It's ridiculous. And so we need to show up at the PUC on both sides. We need to show up when they're passing new kilowatt hours for a positive thing, and we need to show up when they're trying to do things that don't work for us. This No Coal by 2025 campaign has been slightly derailed by this stay-at-home order, but we had made a commitment to 100 days of action, very strike style, with a couple people every day, followed by larger actions on Fridays at noon every day. We were marching on the headquarters there. And when this is all over, we intend to get back out there and do it. So I want to touch on CDOT. So with my work with the Central 70 project and Global Elyria Swansea, I actually left my job at City Council, where I had staffed the Land Use and Transportation Committee, among many other committees, in direct opposition to this highway expansion and also the criminalization of homelessness. Both this project and the criminalization of homelessness were put forth and supported by my opponent, Albus Brooks, whom recently was defeated by Candice Baca in my neighborhood. But we fought through this NEPA process, and particularly the most worried about PM 2.5 pollution. And what we're starting to realize is that there are comprehensive health implications from multiple levels of pollution. And so if you reach your permit, if you're within your permit at 97%, but what if 7 of them are at 97%, and how that impacts the community? Not a single one of them is in violation in particular, but they are obviously having an impact on the community. So we won a $600,000 settlement with the state of Colorado, and those funds go into 2 different things. One, into reforestation of GES. When I ran for city council, I ran on trees, trash, and transportation. But District 9 in particular that I lived in was the least forested of any of the districts in the city. And we know that trees do a lot for energy savings. We know that trees do a lot for air quality, and it's something that we know the people in this community need. And it also put in revenues for this comprehensive health investigation to be completed in 4 years. They're about to put out an RFP. I understand that perhaps your school may be applying to do this analysis and this research. The goal is to really use this as an initial kickoff study. I've been in Washington, D.C. looking for millions. I'm thinking about $8 million. I'd also like to expand this beyond Global Elyria Swansea and to really think about I-70, 270, and the ring within there, and the impacts of legacy pollution and the people who are living there now. But we've also, and this is going to come up a lot, when we talk about land use, we've built these TODs right in the shadow in Wheat Ridge in Arvada on these highways. And we're saying this is where we want our density. And to me, it's absurd to take higher density next to a place that the pollution is known to be the highest. We're just asking for more people to be sick. But that Fast Tracks plan goes all the way back to 2004 when I was 18, and I did vote for it, but I think that the planning could have been done a lot differently, and we're hoping that this comprehensive health assessment can hopefully get to the bottom of some of what's going on here. One other important thing I think to note about this is we've gotten better monitoring as the construction process is going on. For those who don't know, this project actually goes through several Superfund sites, and so we're worried about the particulate dust that's going to be kicked up by it. That's something that the people who live right next to there are the most concerned about. And so what we've been able to do, as I was saying to you about hitting the thresholds of toxicity, now they have to shut down when it hits 90%. and around in the 80s, they have to notify the community to stay inside, right? It makes no sense for us to wait until it becomes toxic to tell people. We need to tell them beforehand, and we need to take measures ahead of time to shut that down. And so there's still a lot, and I'm going to touch on this later, and even my project that I'm working with your organization or with your class on has to do with schools and their placement. And Garden Place Academy, known elevated levels of benzene. um, Globeville, the Swansea Elementary School, excuse me, they think it okay to build a park on top for the children. I don't believe children should be on top of highway emissions. It's absolutely crazy. And what's even more crazy is part of the cost savings and to not trigger new regulation. The actual length of the bridge is just about 10 feet short of what would have triggered them to have these stacks that would allow them to vent higher and things. And so, we have a lot of concerns about that. I do have a lot of conversations with the Colorado Department of Education and school board. We did flip the school board, or the school board was flipped recently, away from charter schools and really focusing on neighborhood schools. And I've been having conversations about how do we keep communities intact, but relocate them while this construction is going on, but keep a school together. They're complex conversations that I don't think that we have answers to. But what I do know is up until now, the school districts have not been involved enough. This last one that I want to point out here is, and this falls into the public health realm, is that we started to have conversations about noise and vibrations. And so now Denver is actually studying. They didn't have a vibration ordinance. They have a noise ordinance, but they don't have a vibration ordinance. And so they've now started along a process with the Denver Department of Public Health and Environment to come forth with regulations to ensure that these people have an opportunity to live peaceful lives. We won some concessions on when and how long construction can occur for to try to mitigate this. Some of these people are offered opportunities to stay other places, and they act as though that makes your community whole. But we all know it's not easier to stay in a hotel than it is to stay in your home where you have all the things that you have and the things that you need. And so one important part here, when I talked about boards and commissions and how they interact with each other, we lost our first variance 2 years ago. And in that vote, there were the board was smaller, and it broke along lines. And it broke along lines with these 3 women of color and 4 white men. And the men said that they trusted the government and the construction to go the right way. And the mother said, oh no, we have to figure out something here, and we lost. Well, we ended up getting, we went to the ballot, it got expanded, and we got new members on, and we got more mothers on there. And the mothers came to bat for us, and we won some variance claims there. So this is the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, in particular air and climate. This has to do with 1261. And 1261 is sets us on a roadmap for meeting goals by 2025, 2030, and 2050 to try to meet the IPCC goals and to bank on them. This was landmark legislation that got through in the last cycle, last year, 1261 and 1281, or 181, which I'll talk about in a minute. But what we've already found is an analysis showing, even with the hard-fought wins, the ZEV, the clean car stuff that they're coming after, a lot of these wins, we are still so far off on meeting our goals. And it's going to take a lot of drastic action with our emission standards and with our transportation network to even try to meet them. I had a chance to go out to an Air Quality Control Commission meeting out in Rifle, Colorado in Mesa County. And at this meeting, only a couple Latinos showed up, even though when we're hoping in this next census, if we're counted correctly, more than 60% of the residents in this community are Latino. They don't have an elected representative or anybody holding their voice for them. And so I went there to support and to testify. In this public hearing, outside of other air quality control commissions, they allowed signs in from the oil and gas industry. And a gentleman even testified in a shirt that said, "Go home wetbacks." I hadn't heard that word uttered out loud since probably the late 90s. And so what it said to me is that we really need to lean in and do more work on the Western Slope. And so a lot of my personal work with Green Latinos, though focused around the state in the last 5 months, has been in Rifle, has been in the Roaring Fork Valley, has been in Mesa and Montrose. There are counties here, Garfield and Mesa County and several other counties, who have sued over these new rules and regulations around the wells in particular, and making sure they're monitoring to make sure they're not leaking. They say that these are different problems. They don't have air quality problems there. Well, this is how it starts. It starts by allowing more of these wells, and it starts to add up. We've seen it here on the Front Range. And moreover, why wouldn't we want to make sure they're checking to not have leaking? If we're going to be going out of our way in the first place to be drilling, wasting it does not make any sense for us. And so that's just something I wanted to put on your radar. There also is a bill that Diana DeGette is bringing to do the same thing, to rein in regulation to reduce waste. And she believes it's a good path forward in a bipartisan way. So the Colorado Oil and Gas Commission, 181, health and safety first. How we got here to 181 in the first place comes back to these oil and gas wars that were going on for years, where citizens attempted to put things on the ballot to try to rein it in under Hickenlooper's administration. Polis brokered a deal that removed a ballot title from the ballot, and was unfortunate after that. This Amendment 74 passed, which made it even harder to alter the Constitution of the state of Colorado. Now it has a much higher threshold to try to enact policy. You're going to see this theme in Denver as well after we won on green roofs, this pushback by those in power to make it harder for citizens to regulate. What I will say is, to any legislator, you guys make hundreds of laws a year, dozens every single Monday night. If the citizens or residents gather together and make one a year or two a year, that's us trying to help you do the right thing. So 181, I ended up testifying for this one. The proceeding started at noon. I testified at 1:30 in the morning. It was a hard battle, but we got it. It now set in place these COGCC rules. Well, they were going through this rulemaking, and by law, they were required to have recommendations out this summer. Because of this, there is a pause. But what isn't paused are new oil and gas wells. So meanwhile, while they don't want to set up a new system that we got through the legislature, the Oil and Gas Commission, the Colorado Oil and Gas Commission, is now continuing to regularly approve permits. And these permits are in places like next to Bello Romero or in Broomfield, where these people live. And so we're really in a place of saying, like, how are we supposed to make progress on our climate if you continue to drill more and more wells? Moreover, we're seeing that the market is being shattered by what's happening here, and the fracking industry is already on pins and needles when it came to accounting. And what we end up with are these abandoned wells, like the one in Frederick, which exploded, or Firestone, excuse me, but Frederick, Firestone, Tacona are the same neighborhood. They're three cities living together. My great grandmother lived there in that community, and my family were pickers in the fields near there. You see action here by Broomfield, where they cited extraction gas for noise violations. Broomfield has also tried to shut down them for saying that drilling right now next to these subdivisions should not be happening during the COVID crisis because more people are at home to be exposed to the benzene than usual. But unfortunately, we just heard news yesterday that the courts blocked Broomfield's attempt to halt extraction gas operations there. And this is where we get into that complex conversation about who has the authority, the state or localities. Really, the 181 conversation goes all the way back to Longmont's fracking ban in their community, and Hickenlooper suing them, saying that they didn't have the rights to do that. So now I want to talk about a few bills that I've been directly working on that would rein in toxins in our community. And I want to touch here on this benzene at Bello Romero. So Bello Romero being the school in Weld County, they originally had plans, extraction, again, the same company, to drill next to a school that was a predominantly white school. Instead, after the uproar, they decided to build it literally across the street from a school that is 90% Latino, serves immigrant populations, many Somalis who work in the slaughterhouses there. And so we recently, along with 350, were part of an analysis that looked at California standards for 8-hour thresholds of benzene, and we found that on a regular basis, the state said they only violated it one time. Our current standards, under these stricter standards, which we're pushing for, 113 times, including 4 school days. Before I was ever in politics, I was a teacher. I take this very personally. These teachers are working underpaid to build the minds of the future, and for them to be exposed to these toxics is unconscionable to me. Um, so this is right here, the $18 million in fines for the Firestone tragedy for abandoned wells. Um, Colorado Rising is bringing forward ballot titles to deal with these shut-in wells and to also talk about setbacks. This last time they were outspent egregiously, and they only lost by 5 points. And so they feel like there's still an opportunity to come forward and get regulation. I also want to point out that there was a recent report that 316 of the 420 active wells in Colorado, the producers, failed to comply with the data that they were supposed to submit to the Department of Revenue, something like 50,000 missing reports totaling $300 million worth of fines. The oil and gas industry always comes forward and talks about how they are Colorado. They are a percentage of the workforce, but the outdoor recreation industry, for example, far outpaces them, and climate change directly impacts whether we have snow or not. So we're saying, when they're saying that they contribute so much back to the community, here's $300 million that they were missing. Maybe you have seen these toxic submissions in the news. There was one even in the first week of the stay in place order here. We're really pissed off about these because these continue to happen. Suncor has really been a bad partner to the community on engaging about the environmental issues. This last one in December, when this yellow smog came out, they said it was just clay, no one should worry, and they offered us free car washes, which was just ridiculous. CDPHE themselves and Tri-County Health called me because they didn't have a protocol in place to collect samples. We clearly are in a place where we are ill prepared to deal with the kind of problems from having this kind of facility in our town. And moreover, the housing crisis and zoning choices by localities are driving more people closer to these highways and closer to these industrial facilities. They recently paid a $9 million fine. It makes up less than 0.2% of their annual earnings. We saw this really as a slap in the face as well. But what it did, it is going to do more for figuring out an emergency plan. Hopefully this money will go back into some programs in the community. This right here is a press conference that we just had a few weeks ago. There on the left is Adrienne Benavidez. She represents Commerce City. Behind her is Alex Valdez. He represents Globeville, Lyria, Swansea. And then to the right here is Julie Gonzalez, who's the senator who represents Globeville, Lyria, Swansea. And Dominic Moreno, who's not here, pictured here. He's the senator for Commerce City. And we brought forth two bills that I'm about to tell you about. This right here, we got Valdez and Gonzalez and Serena Gonzalez elected on a platform of fighting for environmental justice. And if you haven't heard, we have the largest Latino caucus we've ever had, 13 members. Well, actually, we had 14 members, but unfortunately, Rochelle Galindo had to resign, and she wasn't replaced with a Latino. But we have 13 Latino caucus members who are working diligently on these bills for us, fighting for these things. What we've learned in both the I-70 fight and this fight with Suncor is these issues that are trans-jurisdictional along county lines. These borders have been used against us, and it couldn't be more ironic for Latinos to have a border used against them. And so we are working on these two bills, 1265 and 1143. One is trying to regulate hydrogen cyanide, hydrogen fluoride, hydrogen sulfide, and benzene to put monitoring in place for health-based standard rulemaking and improve emergency planning and response measures in multiple languages, linking the multiple languages to the most common language from the school district. That's the second language. The other is 1143, which increases fines from $17,000 to $50,000 a day per fine, per violation. It also will create an environmental justice ombudsman in the governor's office, and the funds will no longer go to the general fund, but into community panels for restorative projects. In an example of greenwashing, the Suncor always points to the Boys and Girls Club that they built. Well, that's called the Suncor Boys and Girls Club. Well, they were mandated to build that. because of a benzene leak into the water, which, by the way, is going to break in the news soon. They've been out of compliance with this entire time. There's also PFAS issues that we're getting ready to. We probably were going to release them at the end of April, but with COVID, we just don't know. But I think the important part is corporations don't deserve to get to take credit for the mistakes they made. Alex Valdez actually, one of his original thoughts was to put shaming billboards up so people would know what kind of problems. They released this amount of hydrogen cyanide. Like, he wanted to really put that out there for people. We're really concerned with what's happening with the legislature. We're waiting to hear what's going to happen with the Colorado Supreme Court. They are in a position right now where we're not sure what bills they're going to take. They're saying maybe only COVID bills. I want to make clear these are COVID bills. The people who are most susceptible to this cardiovascular disease are people with cardiovascular problems, and those are the people in these communities, and that's what these bills do. So if you believe me in that, I would appreciate you to call the governor, call your representative, and say these are COVID bills, and they need to be taken up whenever the legislature comes back. I just want to touch here on what's happening with plastics. We know that there's a battle in many local communities around banning plastics. Unfortunately, we have a ban from the state for localities to actually do it. They say they don't have the preemption to do it. We are working to fight back on that. There are actually 4 plastics bills that are moving through. Well, actually, this first one was killed, and it was killed in committee, really surprising by Senator Angela Williams, who ran for U.S. Senate. The Latino Forum has been really frustrated about this, and we wrote an op-ed actually going after her for this. We don't see any reason why Democrats should be voting against these things. Fortunately, there's a new Representative Woodrow who has just taken the place of Hansen, who has become a senator, and he has said that he is willing to bring this bill back. But again, we don't know what's going to happen with the session. There's also one that has to do with outlawing or really regulating single-use plastics out of our society. We don't see any reason why we're continuing to pile this up. Less than 8% of plastic is actually recycled, and most of us on an average week are eating a credit card's worth of plastic a week. Think about what that is into the system of the youth who is growing. We don't know. The World Health Organization is trying to study the impacts of microplastics right now. There's also one to incentivize recycling markets. We know that China and India and some of these places are saying they're no longer to take our trash, but the problem is plastics only get down recycled. They don't get recycled back into the same product. And so we really just want to try to phase them out. There's another one here that would prohibit the use of polystyrene. Polystyrene being a plastic that has the most stability and hence has the most long-term effects. And then I just want to close with this Colorado component about saying this article just came out yesterday that actually closing these coal-fired power plants, and if we could do them faster, it actually frees up water that they have been using for cooling to help meet our state water goals. So now I'm just going to get into some work with the Sunrise Movement. You can see I'm here on the right-hand side behind the person with the black hat. This is when we marched on Jared Polis's office. They're working nationally on the Green New Deal with Bernie Sanders and with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. It is a great movement. I would say that I am on the top end. I'm about to be 34 of aging out of this. I work with some great high schoolers, people in their 20s, first-time people participating, asking what our plan is. I myself had the opportunity to disrupt the DNC in San Francisco for days on end, demanding climate action. I had a chance to see many of the presidential candidates who came down and talked to us. I had a chance to address the entire crowd, which was an honor of a lifetime in a lot of ways, because I was risking a lot being at the DNC and standing out so forward facing. In the first days, they were saying that there were people on these committees who were saying that people of color don't care about climate change. It's not our number one issue. It's housing and economics, and we say they interweave with all of it. It's complete bullshit, and I actually said bullshit in my speech, and the crowd went crazy. Here is a sit-in from Polis's office that took place asking him to close down the Bella Romero facility. And you'll see me here in the red jacket in the back. I was one of the Capitol 38 that was arrested at the State of the State address for interrupting the State of the State address. There were high schoolers who were manhandled. We spent day in jail, some up to 36 hours. And ultimately, the DA ended up not prosecuting us for this. And I think we really got the point across that we're willing to put our bodies on the line to make sure that Bella Romero closes, that we take ourselves on the right course, and that we're asking Pulse to do the right thing. So this right here was my logo when I ran for city council. I ran on trees, trash, and transportation. Trees, as I said, because we were the least forested, but it also is about parks and things. I was the vice president of the Denver Parks Board at the time. Um, Speaking of political retribution, I actually was appointed by my opponent, Albus Brooks, and so he threw me off of there. It was in the Denver Post. Um, trash being an issue with plastic and these things. They moved away from having large dumpsters to these individual trash receptacles in hopes of replacing trash, but what's resulted, honestly, in more litter. And again, as I was saying, most of these things aren't actually being recycled in the first place. And the last one being transportation, knowing that we have to take on transportation goals. So these were the original goals from the 2020 goals I was telling you about with the Office of Sustainability. Not going to meet a single one of them. So what did we do? We went to work ourselves with the Green Roof Initiative. There I am in that same red jacket. I've had that jacket for like 10 years. And we fought to require green space and open space and solar panels on any of these large industrial buildings that are going up. Not only are these large buildings causing gentrification, they're also causing problems with the environment. And so we really took that on. This is us doing a honk and wave on Spear Boulevard and Colfax. This is us winning. You can see me here. My hair's a lot longer now. I was growing it out. But just despite huge amounts of money being spent against us, we won. As a caveat, we were at a small taco shop for Taco Tuesday watching this election. Our opponents, who had spent hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars, were at Elway's at a steakhouse when they lost. You know, the one thing about running an ordinance is a citizens initiative is that ordinance can be altered by city council, and they went through a stakeholders group in which we had representation. They created a new ordinance called the Denver Building Ordinance, which offered a whole variety of options for getting at the impacts, the climate impacts, the water mitigation, stormwater, all of these things. Unfortunately, to date, only a few of them have been built, but much of the other green infrastructure actually has been constructed. And so we believe this was a great first step. This next one is my work with Sierra Club. You can see me 2 spots over with a bolo on. We pressured Mayor Hancock to sign on to the Ready for 100 pledge to get us to 100% renewable energy here in Denver, and for us to take great steps and leaps and bounds in making sure that our government contracts and buildings were the first to go. This right here, I was telling you about inter-neighborhood cooperation, which is the neighborhood group. The city every so many years sets up a blueprint for growth with transportation and a larger comprehensive plan. I was honored to sit on that and to guide the process, seeking equity and housing. Originally, they were going to go forward with a plan with less than 2% of the respondents were Black, less than 11% of them were Latino. We thought this was not okay. We got it delayed up 6 months. And on this day of the vote, Councilman Cashman actually amended our comprehensive plan to put in a paragraph about climate change and acknowledging the emergency. So one thing that I will say, that I say to my colleagues who don't want to participate in planning processes, if you look at the development of our city, in particular Denver, downtown, any of these places, we follow the plans. So if you want the change, see the change, you go to the plans, because then 2 years later, you can look and say, why aren't you making the good choices? They're in our plans. And it's a locked up case. They can't do much about that. This right here is from the climate summit that the city and county of Denver put on, having Suncor be a sponsor. We were shocked and appalled. And the Sunrise Movement actually wrote a fake press release and distributed it, saying that the mayor was apologizing, the polis was going to declare a climate emergency. It was a tactic. I personally spoke outside against Suncor, saying their conversation is that energy partners need to be at the table. Suncor has been the worst energy partner in our community. For them to partner with them was a slap in our face. This is my statement here from that article that I will say to any of them that if you're not going to lead us in the right direction, we will. And like I said, we've done that through citizens initiatives. And that gets me to the most current one, Resilient Denver. I am the spokesperson for Resilient Denver. Resilient Denver started, we secretly filed on Earth Day, which by the way is my birthday. Um, we secretly filed on Earth Day to put forward an excise tax on pollution, on energy consumption, excuse me, on electricity use and on natural gas use. We put in there caveats for people who were low income. If you bought solar credits or whatever, or you got solar panels, it would actually move you off of having to pay that tax. And the natural gas actually ratchets up over time because we know we need to get people off of natural gas. So when they say that we were on a mad sprint, we had less than 100 days to collect 8,000 signatures. We ended up missing that deadline by 2 weeks. We turned them in, but we came up short, and in 2 weeks we produced the rest. And so the way that works is you have 6 months to try to make the ballot. So since we missed that election, which was last year, we're now, instead of being last fall, we're on the election cycle this year. There was also a really big push when we failed to make the ballot last year. The city council president, Jolyn Clark, and his colleagues were prepared to push through their own version, which would have only had excise tax on commercial properties, not residential. We personally believe that everyone has to do their part in this, and if we can think through the equity components for people who qualify for assistance to not end up having to pay this kind of tax, we were going to be in the right direction. At the 12th hour, actually, that Monday at like midnight, they brokered a deal to create what they're calling a climate task force that's going to, right now they're meeting and we have representation. It's another attempt, I think, at the 2020 goals, but in a more sincere way. It carves out money. It puts $17 million in. I will say that our ballot initiative would have raised $40 million a year, and it created a science-based panel, and it also created a community panel that would decide how these monies would be distributed into Green New Deal programming. And then this component here, so I'm a Resilient Denver is attached to this larger organization nationally called Climate Mobilization, which offers resources. And Climate Mobilization says that the problem is real and that you need to tell the truth, that we need to keep it in the ground now, and that we have to start Green New Deal programming for a just transition. And so the first one with the excise tax is to generate the money for Green New Deal, and then and you'll see here, the second man over, that's Joe Salazar, now former state representative and now the executive director of Colorado Rising. Tony Pigford, who finished third, who circulated a banning fracking petition when he was running for at-large city council. Sonny Benoit, who is the president of 350 Colorado, and Emmett Mobley there, who lives in Northeast Colorado, a very great leader in the community, a partner with me on INC. We were prepared to go door to door and get every signature in Northeast Denver because they're the ones that are facing the largest problems from horizontal fracking. So this was seeking to be a charter amendment. They say initiative here. We filed for a charter amendment, which would require us to get 14,000 signatures in 100 days, which was going to be a lift, but we thought we could do with Earth Day and 420. And so now we're in a place where this is sitting on hold. I actually have a call next week with Amanda Sawyer, who is also trying to think about how to send to the voters not opening any of the 70 wells that are out there at DIA, or possibly legislative rezoning to not allow fracking. I'm not sure if anyone has ever seen the inequity graphs of Denver, but there's this inverted L which Mayor Webb called the Mason-Dixon line, but basically Globeville, Elyria, Swansea, and down the west side is places where this kind of fracking would be allowed. Also at Lowry, which is a Superfund site, nationally, Diana DeGette has brought a bill to try to ban fracking on Superfund sites. And so we're gathering the horses here. We still could just bring this next year on 2021, but we consider it a viable part of it. And just lastly, I want to say Earth Day is coming. And I want to thank you for pursuing your career. I believe in you. I believe in these people who dedicate their lives and the hours and the studying to do this. With this Earth Day, we were planning on having 22 million people outside. Last time the EPA passed on the first million. What we're asking people to do on Earth Day is to hang anything outside of their front door or put it in the window of your apartment to show solidarity. And with that, that's my presentation.